The green waveform was dancing across the monitor of an empty ICU bed while the man who was actually dying was 2 floors below us, unheard by the people who should have reached him first. I had less than a minute to decide whether to shut down half the hospital's monitoring system in the middle of the night or trust the same machine that had already lied to us once, hours earlier. Night shift in an ICU always feels like the world has stepped back a few inches from itself. The lights are lower, the voice is softer, and every sound becomes sharper than it has any right to be. A rolling cart squeaks. From down the hall, coffee burns in a forgotten paper cup at the nurse's station, and antiseptic hangs in the air like a second skin. By 2 in the morning, even the machines seem tired, as if they are breathing with us instead of simply watching. I was checking on Walter Grady, an 81-year-old retired piano tuner with lungs still recovering from pneumonia, when I noticed he was awake again. He had that fragile, stubborn look some older patients get after too many hard years, a body slowed by illness, and a mind that refuses to surrender with it. He kept one hand over the blanket and the other resting beside the pulse clip, listening to the room the way some men listen to weather. When I asked whether he needed anything, he said he was fine, then admitted he had been too afraid to fall asleep. The bed next to him had been empty since the afternoon, stripped, cleaned, and waiting for whoever the night would deliver next. That was the bed whose monitor suddenly exploded into noise. The alarm cut through the room so violently that both nurses at the station ran before their chairs, even stopped rolling back. I turned on instinct, already expecting to see Walter blue around the mouth or gasping against the rails. Instead, he was staring at me, breathing fast but steadily, while the empty bed beside him flashed a rhythm where no patient existed. For a second, none of us moved. There were no leads on the mattress, no body under the blanket, no loose wire dragging from the side rail. Just an empty bed, a bright green heartbeat, and that shrill, relentless warning telling us somebody was in trouble. Walter looked from the screen to my face and said, very quietly, that sound wasn't meant for me, was it? It was the kind of question that lands heavier than it should, because everyone in the room already knows the answer, and no one wants to say it first. I stepped closer to the monitor and watched the rhythm long enough to feel my stomach tighten. It was too rapid, too erratic, and too alive for a dead wire. I called Central Monitoring, asked them to verify the room number, and got a sleepy answer that made no sense even before it finished. They had no active alert assigned to Walter's room, but they were seeing unstable telemetry from a patient in progressive care. While the clerk was still talking, the waveform on the empty bed lurched again, and the alarm shifted into a tone I had learned to fear years ago. Then the overhead speakers cracked to life. Code Blue, Progressive Care Unit, Room 512. The words were flat, procedural, almost cold, but I remember feeling them like a hand closing around the back of my neck. Walter's eyes followed me as I turned toward the door, and in that single breath, between hearing the code and running toward it, I knew the machine in his room had not malfunctioned in the harmless way administrators prefer. It had pointed us to the wrong place while somewhere else a heart was falling apart in the dark. I ran down 2 flights, instead of waiting for the elevator, one hand on the rail, knees protesting louder than my pride would ever admit. The hospital at that hour had the strange acoustics of a church after midnight, every footstep amplified, every shouted order carried farther than it should. By the time I hit the 5th floor, the code cot was already outside room 512 and the doorway was packed with shoulders, scrubs, and fear. There is a particular kind of chaos that only happens when a team realizes the emergency did not begin when they entered the room, but several minutes earlier. The patient was Daniel Mercer, 47, admitted for cardiac observation after a procedure that had gone well enough for everybody to feel comfortable using the phrase stable. He was not stable now. He was gray around the lips, collapsed sideways in the bed, with one sock half off and a telemetry lead hanging loose against his chest like a failed promise. A nurse named Tessa was already on the mattress, starting compressions while respiratory cut away the gown. And Daniel's wife, Elena, stood just outside the doorway with both hands over her mouth, as though she were trying to physically hold her life together. I moved in, took over the room, and did what muscle memory always does before emotion can catch it. We pushed air, pushed blood, pushed time. Orders left my mouth clean and fast, but my eyes kept drifting toward the monitor above his bed. And when the rhythm sharpened into a jagged pattern, recognition hit me so hard it almost felt like nausea. It was the same rhythm I had just seen flashing over the empty IQ bed upstairs. The same frantic electrical shape, the same violent urgency, only now it had a face attached to it. Telemetry never called us, Tessa said between compressions, and there was panic in her voice that had nothing to do with technique. Another nurse insisted the central board had shown him connected. Somebody else said he had alarmed once earlier, but the tone had stopped before anyone could trace it. I did not have the luxury of chasing every sentence in that moment, but the fragments were enough. This was not one missed sound in one room. This was a broken chain, and the worst part of a broken chain is that every link in it belongs to a human being afterward. We got a pulse back for less than a minute. It was weak, thready, almost apologetic, but it was there, and Elena saw it on our faces before anyone spoke. Hope is cruel in hospitals because it arrives dressed like certainty even when it is barely more than a flicker. She reached for my arm and asked if he was coming back. And I gave the only honest answer a doctor can give in those seconds. We're trying. I felt her fingers tighten once, then let go, as if she had understood that medicine sometimes sounds most truthful when it admits how little it controls. When the room finally stabilized enough for me to step back, my scrub top was damp, my throat burned, and Tessa was shaking so badly she could barely fix her gloves. She kept repeating that she should have heard something sooner, should have checked sooner, should have gone in sooner. I looked at the monitor, then at the door, then toward the stairwell that led back up to Walter's empty neighboring bed. And the thought landed with terrible clarity. If one signal had been sent to the wrong room, then we were no longer dealing with a patient crisis. We were dealing with a hospital that could no longer be trusted to tell us where danger lived. Biomedical engineering arrived with laptops, cables, and the exhausted expression of people who know they are about to be blamed for a disaster they did not personally create. Lena Cho led the team, sharp-eyed, efficient, and awake in the way only fear can keep a person awake at 3 in the morning. We stood at a workstation outside Progressive Care, while Daniel remained unstable behind us. And she traced the path of the signal through a maze of bed assignments, software, routes, and a recent systems update that had supposedly improved efficiency after a wing renovation. The more she spoke, the colder the corridor felt. What she found was worse than a simple technical glitch. Several monitoring channels had been mapped incorrectly after beds were renumbered and devices reassigned, which meant an alarm could appear in the wrong room, the wrong station, or on a monitor no nurse was actively watching. In plain language, a patient could begin dying in one place while the machine cried out somewhere else. Lena said it carefully, almost clinically, but I saw the moment the meaning of it landed on everyone listening. Tessa lowered herself into a chair without realizing she was sitting down. The night administrator, Mark Fenley, arrived half-dressed beneath his blazer, carrying the tight, brittle calm of a man already rehearsing the memo he hoped would save his career. He asked whether the problem could wait until morning so the hospital could avoid causing unnecessary panic. Lena said the fastest way to find every affected bed was to take the monitoring network partially offline, remap it, and force manual bedside checks across multiple units while the system rebooted. Mark looked at the staffing board, at the hour, at the liability, and immediately began listing reasons that delay sounded safer than action. I understood his fear because I was carrying a version of it myself. If we shut the system down in the middle of the night, Every unstable patient on those floors would depend on human eyes, human hands, and human endurance alone. No central alarms. No electronic safety net. Just nurses already stretched thin walking room to room, counting breaths, touching wrists, and listening for the first signs of collapse, with nothing but their training and whatever strength they had left. If we did not shut it down, we would be trusting a system that had already sent us to an empty bed while Daniel Mercer fought for his life in the wrong silence. Then Elena stepped into the hallway with Daniel's wedding ring pressed into her palm because respiratory had handed it to her during the code. She asked me one question, and it stripped every abstraction away from the problem. Did the hospital know he was crashing when I did? She was not screaming. She was not accusing. That would have been easier. She was asking in the soft, devastated voice of someone who already sensed that the answer mattered more than any procedure note I could ever write. I looked through the glass at Daniel, at the compression marks rising on his chest, at Tessa trying not to fall apart, and at Mark waiting for me to choose the institution over the truth. I have worked in emergency medicine long enough to know that some decisions are really about medicine and some are about the kind of person you can bear to dawn. So imagine we were going to shut the system down, station people at bedsides, and pull the hospital through the dark, the old way, one patient at a time, with no machine allowed to lie for us again. The order moved through the building faster than I expected and slower than I wanted, which is usually how real emergencies work. Overhead announcements called for immediate bedside checks on all monitored patients in progressive care. Telemetry and ICU overflow. Nurses abandoned computer screens for doorways. Aides became runners. And residents who had spent years trusting dashboards suddenly found themselves counting breaths with watches and fingertips. One by one, monitors dimmed, blinked, and went dark as Lena's team pulled sections of the network offline. And the hospital fell into a silence so unnatural it sounded louder than any alarm. I walked those halls for less than 2 minutes before understanding how dependent we had become on electronic noise. Without the beeping, I could hear everything else. A man wheezing through secretions down the corridor. The soft mutter of a daughter praying in Spanish at her mother's bedside. The rustle of disposable gowns. The squeak of rubber soles pivoting fast on polished tile. Medicine felt suddenly primitive and intimate again. We were no longer being told where suffering was. We had to go find it ourselves. Then Daniel crashed a second time. The call came from inside the room, not from a monitor, but from Tessa's voice breaking on his name. We surged back in. His pulse vanished under my fingers so completely it felt as though the bed itself had gone hollow. Compressions resumed, air moved, medications passed hand to hand, and sweat ran down the center of my back while Lena, kneeling beside a workstation in the hall, shouted that the remap was almost complete. I remember thinking how obscene it was that a man's life could be sharing a timeline with software. We fought for him longer than anyone says out loud afterward. That is another truth hospitals learn to carry. The official record is precise, but grief is measured differently in the body. Elena stood in the doorway again, this time refusing to move. Tears streaming without a sound, as if her whole face had forgotten how to protect itself. Tessa kept compressing even after her shoulders began to fail. And when I took over for a moment, I could feel Daniel's ribs yielding beneath my hands one by one. The awful cost of trying to drag someone back across a line they may already have crossed. At almost the same moment, Lena shouted that the routing was corrected. Another nurse from telemetry ran past and caught a patient in rapid decline because she was physically in the room instead of waiting for a central alarm. That patient lived. Daniel did not. We gained rhythm for breath. Lost she. It again and after 40 everything we had. I heard my own voice call the time of death into a room so full of effort it felt almost insulting to stop. There is no graceful way to end a code. There is only the instant when motion surrenders and silence claims what is left. Elena stepped forward after we covered him, placed her hand on Daniel's hair, and thanked us in a whisper that made every person in the room look away. Gratitude after loss is unbearable because it sounds too pure for a place built on imperfect outcomes. Outside, the monitors began chiming again as the network came back online, cleaner now, correctly mapped, technically safe. But all I could hear was the empty ICU bed upstairs, the one that had screamed for Daniel when Daniel still had a chance to answer. After a death, the room always seems too small for the living. The equipment remains, the sheets remain, the air remains. But something essential has withdrawn and left behind only the mechanical outline of care. Elena sat beside Daniel for nearly 20 minutes before she said a word to anyone. She did not bargain, and she did not rage. She just held his ring against her lips and stared at his face with the stunned concentration of someone trying to memorize the last version of the world she still recognized. When she finally looked at me, I understood that whatever I said next would follow her long after the hospital smell left her clothes. So I told her the truth in plain language. I told her an alarm had appeared in the wrong room, that we were investigating a serious system failure, and that I could not honestly say whether those lost minutes changed the ending, only that they should never have been lost that way. She closed her eyes when I said it, and a single tear slipped down without drama. "Then please," she said, "don't let them call this one of those things." Tessa broke down in the supply room 15 minutes later. I found her sitting on an overturned linen bin with both palms pressed to her eyes, as if darkness could spare her from replaying the night. She kept saying Daniel had trusted them, that she had charted him, smiled at him, promised his wife he was resting, all while a machine somewhere else might have been sounding the warning she never got. I told her what young clinicians almost never believe the first time they hear it: guilt is adhesive. And hospitals are full of systems that quietly try to stick it to the nearest human being. That did not make her cry less, but it did make her look up. By dawn, the conference room was full of people speaking in the polished language institutions use when they are frightened: event review, exposure, communication strategy, temporary mitigation. I listened until I felt my jaw tighten. Then I interrupted and said Daniel Mercer's name out loud, so the room would have to remember this was not a software inconvenience. Lena confirmed the routing error. The logs were preserved. An earlier, unexplained deterioration from the previous week was now under review. For once, nobody asked me to soften the note I entered into the record. Before I left the unit, I stopped back in Walter Grady's room. Morning light had turned the window pale, and he looked smaller in it than he had at 2 in the morning. He asked whether the man with his alarm had made it. I told him no. Walter was silent for a long time, then nodded toward the chart in my hand and said, "Make sure he doesn't get buried in paperwork before he gets buried in the ground," coming from an old piano tuner whose own lungs still crackled with every breath. It sounded less like anger than moral instruction. The hospital resumed its shape by breakfast because hospitals always do. Trays arrived. Shift change began. New families asked ordinary questions in ordinary voices, unaware that the building had spent the night confronting its own blind spots. But the mood was different, thinner somehow, stripped of its usual professional armor. We had seen too clearly what happens when a machine interrupts the bond between suffering and recognition. And once you see that, the work changes. It has to. There are cases you remember because they were difficult. And then there are cases that stay because they altered the way you hear a hallway at night. Daniel Mercer became one of those for me. Weeks later, the monitoring system had been audited. Cables relabeled, protocols rewritten, and every administrator in the building could recite the phrase patient safety event with appropriate seriousness. But none of that was the real scar. The real scar was that I no longer trusted the comfort of a quiet unit the way I once had. For years, I had taught younger doctors that medicine is pattern recognition under pressure, and I still believe that. What I did not say often enough was that the most dangerous pattern in a hospital is the one that teaches you to stop questioning the machinery wrapped around your judgment. Machines are useful. They are fast, tireless, and precise in ways human beings can never fully be. But they do not care. They do not doubt themselves. They do not lean into a doorway because something feels wrong in the room, even before the numbers prove it. I saw Elena once more before she left with Daniel's belongings. She did not want speeches, and she did not want comfort packaged into polished phrases. She only wanted to know whether his death would force anything to change. I told her yes, because by then it was already changing in small, stubborn ways. Nurses rechecking leads with their own hands, residents pausing longer at the bedside before moving on, biomedical staff being brought into conversations they used to enter only after damage had already been done. She nodded as though change was not enough, but truth at least was a start. Walter was discharged 3 days later. He left behind a handwritten note on the tray table, because older men sometimes prefer paper to eye contact when they are trying to say something tender. It read, "The machine heard a heart. You heard a person." I kept that note in my locker longer than I keep most things, not because I felt I deserved it, but because I needed the reminder. In emergency medicine, it is dangerously easy to confuse intervention with witness, to think saving is the only form of service that counts. What changed in me after that night was not some dramatic loss of faith in medicine. It was smaller, quieter, and more useful than that. I started listening harder to silences, to hesitation in a nurse's voice, to a family member who says, "He just seems different," even when the monitor disagrees. Technology can extend our reach, but it cannot replace our responsibility to notice each other. The minute we forget that, we begin outsourcing mercy. So when people ask what that case taught me, I never answer with software updates or policy language, though those mattered. I tell them this instead: the worst failures in a hospital are rarely the loud ones. Sometimes they begin with a harmless-looking screen in an empty room, blinking for someone nobody can yet see. And sometimes the only thing standing between a patient and oblivion is one tired human being willing to believe that an alarm in the wrong place still belongs to somebody.